Let us discuss about outbreeding devices. Outbreeding devices. Already we know maximum plants are bisexual. Till then, the type of pollination which is taking place is not autogamy or self-pollination but cross-pollination. Even though they are bisexual, but cross-pollination is must. Only in case of chasmogamous flower and a clistogamous flower, we do expect self-pollination or autogamy. But even though they are bisexual flowers, maximum pollination is cross-pollination, so that outbreeding devices, in the sense, the devices, the modifications which are there in the flowers in order to prevent inbreeding, self-pollination, and help for cross-pollination or outbreeding. Self-pollination is otherwise said to be inbreeding, and cross-pollination is otherwise said to be outbreeding. And let us see what are the outbreeding devices. A typical 2 marks question they can ask. List out the outbreeding devices. First one, release of pollen grains by anther and acceptance of stigma are not synchronized. This is the first device. In a bisexual flower, anther is also there in the same flower. Stigma is also there in the same flower. But a release of pollen grains by anther and acceptance of stigma are not synchronized. What it means? A time of release of pollen grains by the anther, at that time stigma is not ready to accept the pollen grains, even though they are there in the same flower. When the pollen grains are released, but the stigma is not ready to accept those pollen grains. Sometimes vice versa. Stigma is ready to accept the pollen grains. By the time anther is not ready to release the pollen grains, they are not synchronized. They are not taking place at a time. They are taking place at a different time. So that if the pollen grains are produced earlier, those are carried to the other flowers. Because the stigma of the same flower is not ready to accept those pollen grains. Sometimes the stigma is ready to accept the pollen grains, but anther is not releasing the pollen grains. During this time, pollen grains from other flower carried by the insects and cross-pollination is achieved. This is the first device, helps for outbreeding, cross-pollination, and prevents inbreeding or self-pollination. That is, release of pollen grains by the anther and acceptance of stigma are not synchronized. And a second one, anther and stigma are placed at different positions. Anther and stigma are placed at different positions in such a way that the pollen grains produced by the anther cannot be transferred to the stigma of same flower. Sometimes that style of carpel is very elongated and stigma is totally outside the flower, but the stamens are with short filament, anthers are inside the flower, so that no chance for these pollen grains to reach the stigma which is stretched outward. Sometimes that the style is short, stigma is hidden in the flower, and the stamens with long filament, they are stretched outward so that the pollen grains released from those anthers cannot reach the stigma of same flower. Their positions are different. Even though here the pollen grains may release, at the same time stigma is ready to accept the pollen grains, but the position is different. Pollen grains cannot be transferred to the stigma of same flower. This is the second device which helps for outbreeding or crossbreeding and prevents inbreeding or self-pollination as well. Anther and stigma are placed at different positions. And the next one, that is self-incompatibility. Self-incompatibility. Incompatibility means when the pollen grains fall on the stigma, they are not accepted by the stigma. That is incompatibility. Self-incompatibility means the pollen grains of same flower fall on the stigma. That stigma rejects those pollen grains so that those pollen grains cannot be germinated. Even pollen tube is not formed because they are rejected, because they are belonging to same flower. That is self-incompatibility. We can notice two of this kind. One is incompatibility, another one is self-incompatibility. Incompatibility means pollen grains from other species fall on the stigma. Those pollen grains are rejected by the stigma because those pollen grains are from different species. That is incompatibility. And second one is self-incompatibility. It means the pollen grains from the same flower falls on the stigma. That is self-incompatibility. They can make the neat questions by giving the sentence. One neat question: if the pollen grains from the same flower falls on the stigma rejects those pollen grains, it is said to be self-incompatibility, incompatibility, compatibility, all these. The answer is self-incompatibility. Another neat question: when the pollen grains from other species, different species, fall on the stigma, the pollen grains are rejected by the stigma. This is said to be, once again, same answers. Incompatibility, self-incompatibility, compatibility, all these. The answer is incompatibility. Remember, stigma rejects when the pollen grain from different species fall. That is incompatibility. Stigma rejects pollen grain when the pollen grains from same flower falls on the stigma. That is self-incompatibility. Then one more answer in that multiple choice, compatibility. It means when the pollen grains from other flower of same plant or flower from other plant but the same species fall on the stigma, those pollen grains are accepted. That is said to be compatibility. That is said to be compatibility. Remember, while reading the NEET questions in a NEET book, there will be 4 answers, and among the 4, one is the answer for our question. While reading the questions from NEET book, you should have a plan. Yes, for this question, among the 4, one is the answer. Then what you have to do is, remaining 3 are not the answer for this question, but they are the answers for other 3 different questions. By knowing the answers, you should create or make a question. Here there is an answer. See, here only I have made 3 answers and all these is given. The answer for when the pollen grains from same flower falls on the stigma, stigma rejects them. The answer is self-incompatibility. Another answer is also there, that is incompatibility. You have to create the question. What is that question? The pollen grains from different species falls on the stigma, stigma rejects them. That is, for that the answer is incompatibility. And one more is there here as an answer, compatibility. Pollen grains from different flower from same plant or a different flower from other plant of same species falls on the stigma, it is accepted. That is compatibility. Yes? And remember, concern to this, there will be a NEET questions. Self-incompatibility. In case of bisexual flowers, even though they are at right position, anther and stigma are there at right position, even the release of pollen grains from the anther is synchronized with the acceptance of pollen grain by the stigma. Both above factors are favorable, but when the pollen grains fall on the stigma, they are rejected. That is by self-incompatibility, and that you should remember. And one more NEET question can be asked with respect to this is, among all, which of them is a genetic mechanism? Other are a physical mechanisms, because the position is different and their releasing acceptance is different. But here, even though pollen grains fall on the stigma, but they are not accepted by the stigma, so that self-incompatibility, remember, it is in outbreeding devices, which of the following is genetic mechanism? This is genetic mechanism. Is another NEET question as well. This is very important. Among all the devices, This is a genetic mechanism. Genetic mechanism. And the fourth one, formation of unisexual flowers. Formation of unisexual flowers. Yes. As they are unisexual flowers, it means male flower is different, female flower is different. If they are unisexual, those flowers may be there on the same plant. Pollen grains, when they fall on the stigma, accepted. Compatibility. And that is cross-pollination only, outbreeding only. And male flower is there in one plant and a female flower is there in another plant of same species. During this pollination takes place, it is also outbreeding only. Outbreeding only. Presence of unisexual flowers. Where if the unisexual flowers are there, their outbreeding, cross-pollination is must. If bisexual flowers are there, even self-pollination is also present, maximum cross-pollination. But I have already mentioned, there are two conditions in bisexual flowers. They favor self-pollination. One is chasmogeny, another one is clistogeny. Another one is clistogeny. Yes? And remember all these things. It's a typical 2 marks question also. Outbreeding, what are the outbreeding devices? These are the outbreeding devices. Concern to them, I have mentioned where actually neat questions can be asked. Among them, self-incompatibility is a genetic mechanism. Now it's time to discuss about pollen-pistil interaction. Pollen-pistil interaction. When the flowers are bloomed and a stigma gets exposed, when the stigma of a flower is exposed, pollen grains of same flower may fall on it. One, pollen grain of another flower of same plant may fall on it. Even a pollen grain from another flower of another plant but belonging to same species may fall on it. Even pollen grains from other plant belonging to different species may fall on it. This can happen. But all the time that pollen grain is not accepted. If the pollen grain is compatible, can be accepted. If it is incompatible, cannot be accepted. Let us see. I have written here. When the pollen grain is accepted by the stigma and when the pollen grain is rejected by the stigma. First condition, if pollen grains from different flower of same plant, because the plant is monoecious, where male and female flowers are therein are present on the same plant. If the pollen grains from different flower of same plant fall on the stigma, those pollen grains are accepted because those pollen grains are compatible. They are compatible, accepted, and this is compatibility. This is compatibility, and it leads to a cross-pollination. That cross-pollination is zytonogamy. That also you must remember. Zytonogamy. Only during this condition that pollen stigma accepts pollen grain, that is compatibility, and the type of pollination is zytonogamy. It's a cross-pollination. But this is a cross-pollination, but genetically they are similar. Second condition, if pollen grains from flowers of different plant falls on stigma of flower of another plant with the same species. Here there is a dioecious condition. There is a male plant, there is a female plant. Here pollen grains from this flowers of male plant falls on the stigma of flowers of female plant. Dioecious condition. Two different plants are there. Under this condition also, pollen grains are accepted. Pollen grains are accepted. That is compatibility. Compatibility. And here we could notice genogamy. A type of cross pollination is genogamy. And now, under which condition that pollen grain is resected? If pollen grains from same flower falls on the stigma, pollen grains are resected by the stigma. It is self-incompatibility. Self-incompatibility. It resects the pollen grains and it prevents self-pollination, inbreeding. And if pollen grains from flowers of other species fall on stigma, these are also resected. Why they are resected? They are from different species. And it is incompatibility. See here, whenever the pollen grains are accepted, that is compatibility. When does pollen grains are accepted by stigma? If the pollen grains are from other flower of same plant accepted, that is zytonogamy as well. And another condition where pollen grains are accepted, where the pollen grains from a flower of other plant falls on the stigma of flower of another plant, but both of them are belonging to same species, where it is accepted compatibility and is genogamy as well. That is said to be genogamy. In two conditions, pollen grains are not accepted, they are rejected. When the flowers of pollen grains from the same flower falls on the stigma, they are rejected. It is self-incompatibility, a genetic mechanism. And another one is a pollen grains from the flowers of a plant of other species falls on the stigma of a plant. Here also pollen grains are rejected. It is incompatibility. Take for example pollen grains from mango flower. If they falls on stigma of flowers of neem plant, there will be no pollination achieved because pollen grains are rejected. No fertilization fertilization at all. That is incompatibility. Then how these that stigma rejects and accepts. Whenever the pollen grains fall on the stigma, it may accept or rejects. How? That is by some sort of dialogues between the pollen grain and the stigma. They will have some interaction by the dialogues between the pollen grain and stigma. You may say those dialogues may be like this. When the pollen grain falls on the stigma, stigma asks, "Are you from the same flower?" If it says yes, you are rejected by self-incompatibility. When the pollen grains fall on the stigma, it asks the question, "Are you from a flowers of different species?" If it says yes and you are rejected, will be said by the stigma, that is due to incompatibility. And when the pollen grains fall on the stigma, it asks, "Are you from different flower but same species?" If it says yes, acceptance. That is compatibility. And the next is, when the pollen grain falls on the stigma, it asks, "Are you from a flowers of different plant but from the same species?" Then it says, yeah, when pollen grain says yes, stigma accepts them. Compatibility. It means whenever the pollen grain falls on the stigma, some sort of dialogues between pollen grain and a stigma. Based on those dialogues, either pollen grain is accepted or rejected. And these dialogues are taking place in the presence of some chemical compounds. Some chemical compounds take part in this interaction between pollen grain and a stigma. During their interaction, the chemical secretion will be there by the pollen grain. By that it identifies, is it from the same flower? Is it from the flower of different species? During these two conditions, that pollen grain is rejected. And another one, if in case by the chemical secretion of that pollen grain on the stigma, it identifies, yes, it is a pollen grain from the different flower of same plant, acceptance. And by the chemical secretion, it will come to know, yes, it's a pollen grain from no doubt other plant but belonging to the same species. Under that condition also, acceptance. Whenever the pollen grain falls on the stigma, that pollen grain is either accepted or rejected, which is based on the interaction, the dialogue exchange between pollen grain and a stigma, which is intermediated by the chemical secretion. Once that pollen grain is accepted, then only that pollen grain start germinate and the formation of a pollen tube starts on the stigma. Otherwise, there would be no pollen germination, even pollen tube won't be formed. Now let us see that pollen grain is accepted, so that the pollen grain falls on this is pollen grain. It has fallen on the stigma and this is style and is ori. In this ori there is a ovule. When it is accepted that pollen grain germination starts, otherwise no. And already we know in 60% of plant species pollen grain is released in two-celled stage. One cell is vegetative cell, another is generative cell. In 40% of plant species it is released in a three-celled stage. One is vegetative cell and that generative cell has made two male gametes. In 40% of plant species. Already I have explained this. In case it is falling in a two-celled stage, that generative cell divides and forming two male gametes. And that vegetative cell, that forms the pollen tube, and that pollen tube pierces through the stigma and passes through the style and enters into the ori and it enters into ovule through the micropyle. This is micropyle end and is chelacellate. Micropyle. It has two gametes. It is having two gametes as well. Two male gametes. Now they enter inside. If it is accepted, the germination of pollen grain starts and a vegetative cell forms the pollen tube. This is pollen tube. And this pollen tube pierces through the stigma, passes through the style and enters into the ori, and finally it enters into the ovule. And in almost all the plants it enters into the ovule through the micropyle. If it enters into the ovule through the micropyle, then it is said to be porogeny. Pollen tube enters into the ovule through the micropylar end. It is porogamy through micropyle. Sometimes in some plants the entry of this pollen tube through the chelacel end, it enters through the chelacel end. That is said to be chelazogamy. Here through chelacel end. In some plant species, the entry of this pollen tube through the integuments, the coverings of ovules. It enters inside through the integuments. Where it enters into the ovule through the integuments, that is said to be mesochemy. Here the pollen tube entered through integuments, and most common one is this porochemy. The entry of pollen tube into the ovule through the micropyle, that is porochemy. That is very common in all the plants. But chalazochemy rarely occurs. That pollen tube may enter directly from chalazolate. Even mesochemy is also very rare if the pollen tube enters through the integuments. That is mesochemy. And I have given the heading pollen-pistil interaction. What is pollen-pistil interaction? When the pollen grain falls on the stigma, the acceptance of that pollen grain and entry of a pollen tube into the ovule. The events during all these things is said to be pollen-pistil interaction. What are those events? When pollen grain falls on it, it may be accepted or rejected. That is based on compatibility or incompatibility or self-incompatibility. If there is a incompatibility or self-incompatibility, that is rejected. If there is a compatibility, is accepted, and that is taking place by the dialogues between pollen grain and a stigma, mediated by some chemical compounds. Once it is accepted and that pollen grain starts germinating, in 60% of plants, pollen grain falls on the stigma in a two-celled stage. Those two cells are vegetative cell and a generative cell. If it is the condition, now this generative cell divides and forming two male gametes, and vegetative cell makes the pollen tube. If the pollen grain in 40% of species falls by the time it is three-celled stage, it means two male gametes are already formed. When it falls, that vegetative cell forms pollen tube. Through that, those male gametes enter. That pollen tube pierces through the stigma, passes through the style, now enters into the ovary. Finally, it enters into the ovule through the micropyle. Up to this is pollen-pistil interaction. When the pollen grain falls on the stigma and the events from pollen grain falls on the stigma to the entry of pollen tube into the ovule. This is pollen-pistil interaction totally. And this part is very important. Even this part where they can make many neat questions and ask. By studying this pollen-pistil interaction, we have come to know, plant breeders have come to know some chemical compounds which are secreted by the pollen grains plays the important role. By that only, pollen grain may be accepted or rejected. But we have come to know if the pollen grain from flowers of other species fall on it, definitely they are rejected. But lots of work has been done. After doing, they have manipulated that interaction and made that stigma to accept the pollen grains which have come from different species. Then only it is possible to get hybrids. It is possible to get hybrids because we are after high yield and disease resistant varieties. Nowadays we are doing crossing a plant with resistant power against diseases, and a plant with high yield. If they are crossed, we will have the hybrid. It is a high yielding one, even it is resistant to disease. These experiments have done, and we are getting hybrids with desirable characters by studying that pollen pistil interaction, and they have manipulated and made that stigma to accept the pollen grain. Here we have achieved artificial hybridization. They may be between two different species, that is interspecific hybridization. If it is between two different genera, that is intergeneric hybridization. Here what they do is, the plant breeders, they select those plants. One is male plant and another is treated as a female plant. If both of them are bisexual, even though they are from different species or different genera, in this a plant which they have considered as a female plant, once the flowers are appeared, if they are bisexual, in flowering bud only, what they do is, they open the flowering bud and cut the stamens before they release anthers, release pollen grains. Those stamens in this female plant are eliminated. That is said to be emasculation. Emasculation. What is emasculation? The removal of anthers from the bisexual flower to make that flower as a female flower is emasculation. If the unisexual flowers are there, if that is the plant with female flower, no emasculation is necessary. Emasculation is not necessary here because the flower itself is a female, no stamens at all, so that emasculation is not necessary. In case it is a bisexual flower, we want to make it a female flower, what to do? Those pollen anthers or total stamens from the flowering bud are cut and removed. Now that flower becomes a strictly female flower. This emasculation. This is said to be emasculation. After removing those anthers or stamens from female flower, now it's a female flower, then what to do? A bagging is done. It is covered with a bag, butter paper bag. It is covered in order to prevent the entry of pollen grains from other plants. It is covered. and even they study the time of that stigma which is ready to accept the pollen grains. Even they select the male plant. It may be unisexual with only male flowers, or it is a bisexual. Here emasculation is not necessary. We are after only pollen grains from this plant. We are after pollen grains from this plant. Those pollen grains are taken and already bagged, that female flower. That bag is removed. Pollen grains are dusted over it and rebagging is done. Rebagging is done. Once the rebagging is done, where those pollen grains are accepted by the stigma and pollination takes place, then pollen tube will be developed and that enters into ovule and fertilization is achieved. And from which that ovule becomes the seed and ovary becomes the fruit, and those seeds are hybrid seeds with two desired characters. One is disease resistant, another is high yielding, because we have done crossing between one plant which is disease resistant and another plant with high yield. This is artificial hybridization. And while doing this artificial hybridization to get hybrids of desirable characters, plant breeders, what they did is they have studied that pollen pistil interaction, then selected male and female plant with desired characters. The plant which they have selected as a female, if it is a unisexual flowers, no need to go for emasculation. If it is a bisexual, but we have to make it a female flower by removing the stamens, that is said to be emasculation, and bagging is done. And the male plant, here we are up to only pollen grains, and these pollen grains are taken and bag is removed, dusted over the stigma, and once again rebagging is done, so that pollen tube formation, the male gametes entry into the ovule, and fertilization also taking place. In this way, hybrids can be obtained by the plant breeders by doing artificial hybridization.